I'm the late Leonie Cooper because I've just literally walked through the door, not because I've just passed away. And I am going to be chairing today's meeting. Just the Ticket, Labour's approach to a green transport revolution. I'm one of the 11 London Assembly members. I was elected in 2016 alongside our Labour Mayor Sadiq Khan, and we've been trying to see through a green transport revolution, building on the work of previous mayors, both actually I'd say, over the last 6.5 years. We've got a great panel, and they've promised me that they won't either speak for 20 minutes in their initiating remarks nor answer questions by answering you in half an hour. We've got Ruth Cadbury, who's a very old friend and has worked on air quality issues for I don't know how long, and she is a member of the House of Commons Transport Select Committee. We've got Liam Robinson from Liverpool City Council, who's in the front, who's actually just joining us now.
You just got evicted.
We've got Matthew Pencharz, who is now Head of Public Policy for UK, Ireland and the Netherlands for VOI, but previously hung out in City Hall as one of the deputy mayors, in this case, Deputy Mayor for Transport. So there's a bit of a London thing going on. We've got Philip Glanville, so more London. He's the Mayor of Hackney, and just been re-elected again for his second term. Congratulations. doing great things in Hackney. And we've got Liz Clements, who's the Cabinet Member for Transport at Birmingham. Hello. And then me, and I've said enough about me. So without further ado, I'm going to start at this end of the platform with Liam, even though he's only literally just sat down, and he's going to hopefully tell us about what's going on in terms of a green transport revolution in Liverpool. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, everybody. And I suppose going first is my punishment for being late. I apologise that I've had to hot foot from the last sort of fringe, but obviously that's always the way during conference week, isn't it? No, I'm really pleased to sort of be here. And I think this is an absolutely fantastic fringe in terms of how the Labour Party is going to be at the forefront of that green transport revolution, because here in the Liverpool City region, we believe we're genuine on the front line of that green transport revolution. If you like, we are the shock troops in some of the things that we are delivering locally. And quite frankly, we have to do that because as a coastal city region, climate change will significantly impact upon us. If we don't ensure that global temperature increases stay below 2 degrees, where you are sat at this moment in time in 30 years will be flooded. The River Mersey would break its banks all the way inland as far as Warrington. Other large swathes of the city region will be effectively subsumed by the Irish Sea. So we genuinely have to deliver this green transport revolution. Well, for us, actually, there's a number of key ways in which we are genuinely doing that. One of the things we're in the process of about to introduce onto the local Merseyrail network, that obviously is a devolved network controlled by us, is a brand new fleet of publicly owned trains to run on that network. They're publicly owned because, quite frankly, it's a third cheaper. Whoop and holler if you want, it's brilliant, because they are actually a third cheaper for us to borrow through public sector sources than to go through what I will bluntly call a failed privatised Roscoe route. Why would we torch taxpayers' money when actually there's a much better way that the whole of the British rail industry can learn from here in the Liverpool City region? But it's not just public ownership in name that we, the 1.6 million people of the region, will own the trains. It's public ownership in action. We've had 40 everyday Merseyrail customers design all the specifics of their brand new trains. So as well as some of the kind of internal stuff, there's some really pioneering functions on those new trains, including for the first time on the heavy mainline network in Britain, level access from the platform to the train at every station, at every door. When we started this procurement, the industry was telling us far too difficult, it'll never be done. Well, I can tell you, in a couple of months' time, I'll be able to show you exactly how it is done. Secondarily, the Merseyrail network is an electrified network taking its power from a third rail. The great thing about our project is every train will have a battery fitted onto it, so the ability to go beyond where there is electrification and massively expand the local rail network is absolutely huge. And I've got people in Warrington, in parts of Preston, in North Wales, queuing up to say, when can Merseyrail services come to our area? So we're very, very sort of optimistic about where we're going with that. We also want to pursue more devolution on our local rail network, looking at the opportunity to have a bit more devolution over the infrastructure, looking at the potential of taking some of Northern Rail services under our umbrella. On the bus side of things, well, I'm not going to mince my words here, and I hope I'm really preaching to the choir when I say that bus deregulation was a failed experiment that has not worked in the slightest. You know, I think at best you can call it a patchwork quilt where you have different things happening in different parts of areas. All too often, actually, it's a jigsaw puzzle where pieces of the jigsaw are missing and not fitting together, and when you look back, it's a complete mishmash of a picture. So one of the things we will be doing is re-regulating our bus network, and we already have an example of that with one of the hydrogen buses you can see on the Albert Dock accordingly. The final elements, obviously, is what we're doing about active travel. We're rolling out 600 kilometres of high-quality walking, cycling infrastructure, some of which you can see close to the conference centre, but equally as well looking at other elements, and I don't want to spoil Voi's thunder, but a very, very positive e-scooter trial that actually has been one of the most successful in this country, but equally has been one of the most successful in the whole of Europe. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Liam, for kicking us off there. And the sooner you take Avanti West Coast into public ownership, the sooner every single person who's come to this conference on that train will be delighted, I should think. And we keep bidding for having more than just London Overground in public ownership in London. So I'm sure you're feeling the same way as we do. I'm going to move straight on to Ruth Cadbury. I just introduced Ruth just now, so I won't introduce her again. Ruth, over to you.
Thanks very much, Leonie. So the one thing I'm not is on the front bench transport team, but you'll have seen Lou's statement today about nationalising rail. But I'm a bit of a transport anorak. I'm on the Transport Select Committee. I chair or co-chair the all-party parliamentary groups for walking and cycling, for women in transport, and transport safety. So, you know, green transport, I think is inherent in our policies at the moment, and Labour's policies, green transport policies are, very much at the core of the fairer, greener future that we need. We have to work to net zero by 2050. We have, by meeting the climate crisis head on, and Liam just stressed that so powerfully for how, why it's important to this region, but it's obviously important to us all. And that means we need to encourage and support more sustainable modes of transport, from flying to rail, to public transport, to active travel, and cars and other road vehicles. They need to be as green as they can, and I mean, what's enabling and empowering cities and regions to do that, and Labour mayors and Labour leaderships are really showing the way. And also, and not just around the green agenda, but also affordability, which is just so important in terms of the cost of living crisis and what matters to most people in this country. And we've got a government that talks the talk, as you all know, on net zero, but they just fail to act, and far too much warm words. And the jet zero strategy on aviation is neither zero or a strategy. No frequent flyer levy, further delays to airspace organisation, which will deliver some carbon savings, and no absolute stop on airport expansion. And I'm a long-standing campaigner in West London, my constituency, against expansion at Heathrow. Rail, we need to push ahead with the rest of HS2, Northern Powerhouse Rail, electrification, for all the obvious reasons, including reducing congestion and air pollution at ground level, as well as carbon saving. Active travel, again, a lot of the good practices going on under Labour authorities and Labour regions. Electric vehicles, Grant Shapps loves them. I mean, for those vehicles that need to be on the road, we do need to, the government is just dragging its feet on things like rolling out the infrastructure for charging. The pricing system is a mess. The Transport Committee, we did a report on that. We need to have a proper national scrappage scheme that makes EV ownership affordable to those who need to own a car. And of course, with the decimation of the bus services, too many people are forced back into owning a car, driving a car, when the sensible alternative for many of them is actually in most of England, not in London where I am, but you know, most of England is being cut. And the government seems to think local authorities are going to pick up the tabs for those routes that are no longer viable. And of course, you know, that local authorities aren't in that position. And that's it for me for now. Thank you.
Wow, I'm just saying 1 minute left, but thank you, Ruth. So without further ado, I'm going to carry on moving along the line, and I'm going to bring in Matthew Pencharz next. Matthew.
Thanks very much, Leonie. It's great to be here. And it's great also to have heard over the weekend the Labour's Green Growth Plan. And when you think about that, transport accounts for 20% of the country's carbon emissions, a proportion that has been increasing as we decarbonised, or decarbonising, I should say, other sectors. But also we've seen the transport proportion going up as cars have been sadly getting bigger, as people may have noticed, more and more SUVs, but also switch away from petrol to diesel, from diesel to petrol because of air pollution concerns. And it's really very important that as much as we do the change to electric vehicles, what we don't want to do is simply swap one for one. It's not going to solve our climate problems is by swapping every single ICE vehicle for battery electric cars. And when you think about the government's target, and I'm afraid to say, I think we'll see how hard they will continue to try to hit these targets that they set themselves, but they put one, 50% of all urban journeys should be done by walking and cycling by 2030. I mean, you think that some 60% of car journeys are less than 5 miles, and a quarter of them are less than 2 miles. There's a lot of journeys that could have modal shift away from, in particular, single occupancy car journeys. I think we all know that not all car journeys can be displaced at that distance. Sometimes you've got children in the car, or you're taking stuff to the dump, or you're buying a fridge or whatever, but lots and lots and lots of those journeys can be done by more sustainable modes. And it's really important to give people choice. Now, I'm a cyclist, but not everybody wants to cycle or can cycle. And it's really important that different sustainable modes are offered to people. And that's where light electric vehicles, and I represent Voy, which is an e-scooter, e-bike, micromobility operator, can really come in. And as Liam says, hopefully you've seen our coral red scooters in Liverpool. And he's absolutely right. It is one of the most successful schemes here in England, and therefore across all of Europe, all the markets that Voy operates. We operate around 2,500 of scooters here in the city, and there have been 3 million rides taken by over 200,000 different people here in Liverpool. That is around a third of the city's population, which shows you how much of a market there is for this alternative green form of transport. And when our users tell us that 29% of our users tell us that journey would otherwise have been taken in a car or taxi, you can see that we really are displacing a great deal number of car journeys. And here in Liverpool, that's over 1.25 million, in fact. And similarly, Cllr Liz Clements here on my left, working with her offices in Birmingham, we have a similar, we are also operating in her city as well. And we have just hugely expanded the operating area in Birmingham to hopefully begin to catch up on Bristol and Liverpool, which are Voy's leading markets at the moment. But I'm sure Birmingham will do. And we were very proud to work very much with the City Council and with the combined authority there to help on the transport for the Commonwealth Games that was such a success over the summer. And we are working largely with progressive Labour administrations across England, and we've hit 20 million rides in total, and that is again 6.5 million car trips that have been replaced. And since we're talking about going for growth, I think it's worth saying the market potential for LEVs is worth billions of pounds, and we're working with the Warwick Manufacturing Group, which is in the West Midlands, at Coventry, where we also operate, about how we could onshore perhaps some of the manufacturing of these scooters, bringing that manufacturing and skills and investment here to the UK. But we really need, so the private sector is really here to help progressive authorities on this journey. But the appropriate rules need to be set. We can make sure it's safe. We can make sure it's sustainable. We can make sure it's affordable. But the convenience levels is really set often in partnership with the local authorities. It's very important people get their phone out and they can see an e-scooter and e-bike is very close to where they are. Otherwise, they can float back to using more unsustainable modes. And on that, hopefully just about on time, Leonie.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much perfectly on time. So thank you for that. And can I also say thank you to Voy for partnering with SERA on setting up today's meeting, just before I bring in Liz and Philip. And the person who's done all the sort of heavy lifting on making sure that everything happens is Matt Gaffar, who's the SERA organizer, who I think is just going to stand up now and wave to everybody. There you go. I've probably greatly embarrassed him, but thank you very much. Because I did absolutely nothing to make the arrangements for this meeting, but other people did and worked hard to make this happen. And I hope you're finding it interesting so far. And on that note, I'm now going to move on to Liz, who is going to talk about Birmingham. And like London and Liverpool, there are huge transport challenges in Birmingham. And we need to hear from Liz how they're being addressed.
Thanks, Leonie, and thanks to SERA and Voy for inviting me today. It's a really good opportunity. And listening to Liam, I found particularly inspirational. And that's an example of what Metro mayors can do if they're in power, if they are Labour Metro mayors. So I think for anyone who's here for the West Midlands, the biggest learning point from this session will be we need a Labour Metro mayor in the West Midlands. That's just a takeaway. So let's focus on that. Obviously, on a platform like this, there's some healthy competition between different city region areas, and I'd say Birmingham is a place where transport revolution is underway and has been for some years. In fact, we've had a process called the Birmingham Cycle Revolution, which has been ongoing since 2014 and started off in a council scrutiny review. I always like to mention that because I spent 4 years as the council's transport scrutiny chair before I became the cabinet for transport. Obviously, we're starting on a low base. We started on a low base in Birmingham. We've been motor city. We've got decades of car dependency that we're trying to overturn. Every day, 250,000 short car journeys of less than 2 miles are being done in Birmingham, and we've just simply got to reverse this. So I want boldness from myself and other Labour politicians. We've got to address the fundamental issue, which is too many cars. We need fewer cars. And when it gets down to the nitty-gritty of consultations about LTNs or cycle routes, that's where it starts to turn nasty. And we've got to start holding the line on that. So if any of you made it up to Birmingham or down to Birmingham during the Commonwealth Games, you will have seen city centre that is transformed. It's walkable. There are cycle routes. There's people scooting. We had temporary free bus transport. It was agreed that there would be no car journeys and no parking to the Commonwealth Games venues. And for a lot of people who were going to the Commonwealth Games events, I'm sure that was their first experience of taking a bus since they were a child or ever. So I want that to be a platform on which we actually push for our existing mass transport system in Birmingham, which is buses. We also got a new railway station out of the Commonwealth Games. Perry Bar railway station has been completely rebuilt, and University Station, which these are key stations, and University Station was completely rebuilt. So it's worth taking a trip to Birmingham and looking what it is like nowadays. I have lived in Birmingham since 1999. I can't drive, so I have depended on walking, cycling and using public transport in the city for 23 years, and I can tell you that it's changing, but there is a long way to go. We have a big strategic framework, that is the Birmingham Transport Plan, and it is about tackling car dependency and looking at what is the most appropriate way to move around in the city of Birmingham. So we're going to reallocate road space everywhere, give buses priority. Look, we're introducing city centre cells in the city centre. Those are effectively 7 giant LTNs, which will stop you doing through car journeys. In neighbourhoods around in our suburbs, we're looking at active travel, low traffic neighbourhoods, much better infrastructure for walking and cycling, and we're pursuing a more effective parking management strategy, because really we need to get cars out of the city centre, and also look at what is the real parking need in neighbourhoods, always with the vision of getting to fewer cars and more active travel and more use of public transport. We also have a charging clean air zone, which, despite a lot of controversy in the run-up to its introduction, is actually working really well, and it generates a lot of net surplus revenue for us to invest in things like car-free school streets, hydrogen buses, which are already running on the 51 route from Walsall to Birmingham, and new railway stations on the Camp Hill line, which is reopening. So it's proving a useful tool in terms of transport infrastructure investment, as well as tackling air quality problems in the city. And as the incoming cabinet member, my priority is looking at the introduction of a workplace parking levy in Birmingham, because that's a way of generating some more resources to fund transport. And that brings me on to one of my main issues, because this event is titled Just the Ticket or something, and ticketing is absolutely an obsession of mine as a public transport user. We must have cheaper and simpler fare structures that people understand and will incentivize them to get on public transport. So I have a visual aid. That is my €9 ticket from my summer holiday in Germany. I made extensive use of the heavily subsidized public transport in Germany in August. And I think that if we want people to think of public transport as a viable alternative to just getting in the car, you need to be able to do it spontaneously without having to research the ticket for weeks beforehand. So we just need to think about what is the lived experience of passengers. And on just last week, I was in Rotterdam in Delft looking at cycling infrastructure with Sustrans, and again, we just have so far to go in Birmingham. We have some segregated cycle routes, but the cycle revolution must include a lot of cycling, and cycling has to be safe for women and for children. So we have a revolution ongoing, but there's much more transformation to do in our city. But come and have a look, you'll be surprised.
Well, I hope you're thinking of some great questions, because all the speakers are very much sticking firmly to time. So thank you to everybody. And that's not a hint that Philip Glanville can go last and then talk for half an hour. But yes, some of those are just huge resonances, certainly for anyone who's been in Liverpool or London. And we're all very jealous that you managed to get a ticket without having to spend hours researching it, because I think everyone who wanted to use Avanti West Coast had to keep refreshing the website for about 3 weeks before any tickets were released. However, over to Philip, who's going to tell us about Hackney.
Thanks, Leonie. Thank you to SERA and Voy as well for organising the event. I'm here to bring a sort of bit of London Council's perspective, and especially Hackney, and I'll lead on to where I think the lessons from Hackney and London go in terms of a green transport revolution. But I think finished off, reclaiming our roads to be people-centred is absolutely essential. Moving away from a car-based system has to be at the heart of everything that Labour is doing locally and nationally, and that isn't easy for some of the reasons that Liz has talked about, but it is absolutely essential. As we started our journey around a more progressive transport policy, looking at where the traffic came from was really vital. And anyone that's come to SERA event will have heard these stats before, but I think they really ground us. 40% of traffic in Hackney is not serving any social or economic purpose. It doesn't start or stop there. And that's in a borough where 70% of Hackney residents don't own a car. So there's real social inequity there. And so it means really having a sustainable and active transport policy that tackles climate change, air quality, but also the use of public space. And when you look at our transport emissions, which are a key part of our emissions in Hackney, again, 70% of our transport emissions are from privately owned cars, motorbikes, and vans. So if we're going to tackle those things and deal with the social inequity, we have to invest in active travel and public transport. And the public health consequences of not doing that are really stark. 66% of cancer-causing chemicals emitted in Hackney, or in our 10% most deprived wards. Those wards don't have high levels of car ownership. I think across London, when Sadiq started talking about the ULEZ, 4,000 Londoners premature deaths due to air pollution, and we've modelled in terms of the cost to the local health system around £50 million worth of cost around air pollution. And we know that we can have a better transport system, that if we're going to tackle the climate crisis, the air quality crisis, and now this cost of living crisis, and level up communities within London, within Hackney and across the UK, we've got to make these interventions. So in Hackney, we already have the largest network of secure bike parking on our streets anywhere in London. And we've pledged to increase that by another 4,000 spaces in the next 3 years and make them the cheapest to hire for our residents. We've de-paved nearly 4,000 square metres of public highway, so thinking about SUDs and sustainable urban drainage. 85% of residents live within 400 metres of a cycle route or quiet way. 48 school streets, increased from 9, so we did all that work during the pandemic, and a bold and ambitious plan to expand our school streets going forward. And 70% of our residents live in a low-traffic neighbourhood. And I think Ken, who helped organise this event, there's a competition now between Newham and Hackney to who has the most low-traffic neighbourhoods anywhere in London. And when we go back to who contravenes our school streets and our low-traffic neighbourhoods, 80% of drivers outside of Hackney. I think it's really important to say that we can't have a transition just based on EV vehicles. We're really passionate about rolling out 3,000 EV chargers, but they contribute a huge amount still to pollution. There's the extractive impact on the global south. And 36 million seats lie vacant every morning in a morning commute in the UK. So the tremendous cost and waste of converting those 36 million seats from petrol and diesel to EV is not something we want to do as a society. And 62% of all car journeys are from a single driver. And just because they're an EV driver does not make them better. We want to get to 80%. We already 80% active travel or public transport in London, but obviously we've got further to go in London. I think we've seen from this panel real leadership from metro mayors, city leaders, and others, Labour leaders across the country. The renaissance that's happening around buses in West Yorkshire, Liverpool, and Manchester, I think, is incredibly powerful, and we need to continue to take it forward. But we're a really centralised state still. And I was with the leader of Leeds at a previous event, and you know, our city is not built by people getting on trams and get steam trains down to Whitehall to beg the transport infrastructure that was delivered in the Victorian era of municipalism. And it shouldn't be like that now. We shouldn't have to be constantly going to London to beg for a new bus stop, tram extension, these types of investment. And proximity to power in Hackney, yes, we're closer geographically to Westminster and Whitehall, but we're just as infantilized when it comes to transport funding. And I think that is something that we've all got to campaign and to take forward. And for me, where we have to go is building on the success stories that we've heard about from the panel. It should never cost you more to park a bike in a secure parking space than it does a car, even an EV car. That should just be fundamental, and we need the powers and funding to enable that to happen. A family of 4 going shopping in their town or city centre should not be paying more on the bus than it costs to drive and park a car in that town centre. Otherwise, we're not going to get this transition. And we cannot have the situation where to travel between our major cities, if you're not going via London, it is cheaper to fly than get a train and then an integrated transport system. And I think that's Liz's point about ticketing and the detail of how we help and enable people to make those choices, whether it's e-scooter, ticketing around buses and public transport. For me, that is what we need from a progressive Labour vision for transport as we move into government. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to see if this one is now working. That is fantastic news. Do you need 1 or 2? One is going. Okay, that one's not really very functional. I think we'll stick with this one, so we'll have to pass this up and down the speakers. However, we have a roving microphone, and if you haven't been inspired to ask a question after all of those contributions, I don't know what will inspire you. I can see 1 hand there, and I can see 1 hand there, and then 1 hand there. So we'll go in that order, because that's the order I saw you in, and we'll take those 3. Or do them in reverse if you want, if the person there is nearer.
Hi, I'm Ant Reid from Labour.
Could you say if there's someone specific that you would like to answer your question?
Actually, no, because it's a broader question on strategy. Ant Reid from Labour Coast and Country, and I'm for Rural Councillor from Stone CLP. How do we make sure that our transport strategy goes beyond the city boundary? So we're 5 miles from a town. There's no pavement. There's no safe cycle route. The last bus is at 5:30 at night. The last train was 1965. How do we get rid of cars in our town?
Okay, thank you. That's a really good one to start with. Can we say I can't see who you are.
My name's James Hewitt.
Okay.
I'm interested in cities and the role of road pricing, whether that's a complete distraction or whether that would actually help. And part two is we've got a problem with climate change. We are not measuring how rapidly we're reducing our emissions, scope 1 and 2. Can one use, and how would one use, the progress to meet World Health Organization targets for air quality as a proxy for progress against climate targets? Thank you.
Oh, very cheeky, got 2 questions in there. And finally, I can't also say.
Yes, thank you. I found all the contributions really interesting because this is such an urgent matter and it's difficult to sort of tackle urgently. I'm a resident in Liverpool, but I'm a Londoner. So it's a question to Liam. Liverpool's doing a lot, but what do you do about cars? I mean, this was coming up in Birmingham as well. How do you manage cars out of the city centre? Because, you know, they are so essential for so many people, the buzzing to the different pressures that they have in work and children and all the rest of it. But unless the fare, you look at fares and frequency, I think it's very difficult to look at a bus service. What is the timetable on getting the buses kind of more coordinated, and what is the timetable on the possible faster train to Manchester?
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
I'm going to start with Liam because he's been specifically asked the last question, and if you want to comment on the previous 2, and then I'll ask the other speakers to come in on the other 2 questions.
Yeah, of course. No, really important points about what we do with cars within the city and the wider city region, because we actually have one of the lower levels of car ownership of comparable cities. About a third of our residents across the region haven't got a car because crudely they can't afford one because of levels of deprivation. That doesn't mean that car ownership and car usage isn't an issue. For me, being very honest about it, I think we have to significantly improve the public transport network first, and then potentially look at what car restraint measures we have to put in after that. Now, that isn't a false promise, because in the next couple of years, you will see things like the brand new trains I talked about. Equally, without getting too anarchy about the kind of legislation on buses devolution, you should see the first re-regulated services within the next 2 years. And obviously, it will take up to 5 years to roll that out right across the city regions network, because quite frankly, we're unpicking 40 years worth of deregulated damage, if I put it as sort of hard-edged as that. We do know fares is absolutely key to this. We've been able to cut the bus fare down to £2 in the past fortnight, similar to what they're doing in Manchester and West Yorkshire. We hope under a re-regulated structure, we'll be able to actually go a bit further with fares and set them at the lowest financially sustainable level. Then we can start looking at what we might need to do with further pedestrianisation and car restriction in the city centre and other parts of the city, schools, streets, low traffic neighbourhoods, and so on. I think that then also links onto some of the other points that were made, you know, particularly when we look at things like kind of how is this not just cities. I think being dead honest about it, it's about making sure there's a good funding settlement right across the country. Do not get me wrong, I'm certainly not kind of suggesting London should get anything other than the best deal for London. But over the past decade, we have seen funding for London and the South East about £500 higher than all the other regions of the country. And we all need the right funding settlement. And crucially for rural areas, power as well. Because actually devolved buses powers at the moment are only available in their full suite to metro mayoral areas. So I think for me, those are some of the kind of things that we need to be kind of looking at.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Ruth then for some further comments on moving beyond cities, road pricing, help or hindrance, WHO targets. Can we use those as a proxy for what we need to do moving forward on meeting the climate targets? Ruth.
Okay, I mean, and your point about rural accessibility. I mean, Beecham decimated local mobility, but so and the current decimation of bus services. And we've got a government actually made up of, its support in Parliament is made up of an awful lot of MPs representing rural areas who are, at a far higher proportion than Labour is, and they are angry and upset on behalf of their constituents. I've heard quite a lot of them whining on, but they've got a government who frankly doesn't care. And we had them. I just was in a shocking Transport Committee session with Baroness Veer, who has now got the active travel portfolio. She stayed on the transport front bench for the Tories, but it was Chris Loder from the Southwest asked about how do we protect and rebuild the rural bus service, and she said, "Oh, well, local authorities can pay for it, can't they?" Just complete. That and her absolute sectarian attitude towards Sadiq Khan, which of course was led by Grant Shapspout. So there is a massive issue. But I mean, rural towns, small towns, there's probably an awful lot of short distances being travelled by car in those towns, and of course because they're magnets for they're a spider's web of routes, and then they just get jammed completely solid because you've got a mixture of people who have no choice but to come in by vehicle, whether they're for delivering a business or farmers, or whether they're local people coming in for the shopping or school or whatever. But they're adding to an existing issue of a lot of journeys that, if the pavements were wider, if there was active travel alternatives, those sort of things. But the market, well, see what Voy says, but the market for e-scooters and e-bikes, if it's commercially led, probably isn't big enough in a country town. So there is a massive challenge there. And that's, I'm not promising anything, obviously, but there's no doubt there's a challenge. But, Labour has, strong, and thanks to groups like yours, strong understanding of rural issues. Well, I hope we do. And road pricing, we have to have a fiscal solution to the fact that the loss of tax revenue from fossil fuels and vehicle excise duty. So that's for the Treasury team, and I'm sure that they're probably not going to put anything in a manifesto, but there's no doubt that we have to tackle that because it's one of the biggest sources of tax to the Treasury. I don't know about the answer to air quality as a proxy, but I do know that I've had some very angry constituents who say, but my car is low emission, but it's caught by the ULEZ because the NO2 emissions and CO2 emissions don't line up. But I think that's what you're trying to say, and it does sound logical. So yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll see if we've got some more things to come from the other panelists on the points that have been.
Thanks. So picking directly up from what Ruth said around the commercial viability of micromobility operators such as Voy and our competitors when it comes to delivering outside of big towns and cities. And I'll be honest, it is a challenge. So it does not require subsidy if it is allowed to create a convenient service so our vehicles are utilised at the kind of rate that means a return, obviously on the capital investment of buying all the technology and the bikes and scooters and the rest of it. But it is possible if you, for example, in one scheme operated by one company, you had a big town or city, and then you had a bunch of satellite schemes nearby, operate from the same warehouse, because then of course you've got the economies of scale, and a lot of the sort of overheads are covered with what is hopefully the profitable big city scheme. So we operate, for example, in Northamptonshire, which is, I have to say, the only one actually run where the governing party is Conservative. All the rest of our markets are Labour or in one case Lib Dem. No, two Lib Dem, sorry. But that is an example where we do have a big town, Northampton, and then we have these satellites in some of the market towns in that county. And that is a model that could potentially work, where we could bring this service to a more rural location. There is a final point on the financial sustainability in that we're all aware of the macroeconomic circumstances that we're living in at the moment, and all operators, not just us, having to focus very much on making profit and breaking even. It is not an industry that is mature at all. We're quite early doors, but we don't require subsidy. But what is a danger is if local authorities, because they look at their own balance sheets, think, oh, I know what, we'll try and get some money out of these operators. That could lead to operators simply not being able to run the service. So there is a balance there about the financial sustainability. When it comes to road user charging, absolutely, I think to Ruth's point, this is something that should have been addressed quite a while ago. I don't really see this government doing it, so clearly a job for the next Labour government. To pick that up, I would have thought fairly quickly. But again, it's where different alternatives to the car are really important. It's going to be quite a shock to everybody that suddenly they're paying by mile or however it might work, as opposed to paying fuel duty and vehicle excise duty. And again, giving people options, whatever they might be, alternatives to the car, may sugar that pill somewhat. On air pollution as a proxy, as Leonie said, I used to work at London City Hall at the back end of when all the cars were dieselised. So because it was thought in the late 90s into the early noughties, we should go for diesel because it's better for carbon emissions. That is true on the motorway, not necessarily true inside urban areas, by the way, but it's far more high polluting. So we saw there, driven for the right reasons, let's deal with carbon. It had a pretty very negative effect, especially on NO2. And then similarly, if we switched all ICE vehicles to battery electric vehicles, it'll have a pretty good thing on air pollution, and it will have an effect definitely on carbon emissions, but you still have all the embedded carbon in a 3-ton Tesla, whereas you could be on a push bike or a 35-kilo Voi or whatever, an alternative to, or a train or a bus, but an alternative single occupancy car. So it can work, but I think a lot of the time they're out of kilter, so doesn't quite work, I think.
Thank you. Do you want to come in as well and add some further points? And can I just make one point? We're not going to deal with the situation outside cities unless we can deal with frequency and reliability of those services. I mean, I live in London and I get cross if the tube train sign says it's not coming for, it's more than 3 minutes. but I have also worked outside of London in the East Midlands and East Anglia, and was trying to persuade staff of the housing group that I was working with to move away from having company cars. And of course, they would say, well, if I took the bus to that village to go and talk to people about transfers and collect rent, I wouldn't get back in 3 days. So until we sort that, the 3 minutes versus 3 days, we're still on a hiding to nothing. But I'm still going to bring in Liz, who may hopefully tell us that things are more frequent than every 3 days in Birmingham.
No, I was actually going to talk about my own experience. I was previously a county councillor in Oxfordshire, where I chaired a public transport committee in the late 90s. And at that point, we had a significant budget to subsidise, so-called non-commercial routes under the privatised model. So it's possible to provide rural public transport with the funding and the political will. So, I mean, if you gave the councils the money and they had a progressive vision about reducing car dependency in villages and small settlements, then that would be the way to do it, preferably in a publicly owned bus network. And again, I think we need to raise our sights and we need to go and look. Let's go and talk to our sister parties in Europe, the ones that are running the country, like in Germany or in Spain, because in Austria and Germany there are small hamlets, that have got good bus services. There's a minimum frequency guarantee for villages of over a certain population. And there's post buses. My background studying German, so I'm quite obsessed by this. But it's possible to do it. We've got too much sort of fatalism that we've had, decades of Tory disinvestment, privatisation, inferior public transport. It can be different, and you just need to cross the channel and look what's on offer there. On the air quality, we're waiting to see what gets actually put in the targets in the Environment Act, because the government is still, I think, delaying on that. We should be looking for the World Health Organization targets, because in Birmingham, we're coming near to. We've got good progress on reducing NOx emissions, but that's with the existing threshold, and that we haven't started looking at the WHO targets. And on road pricing, I think yes, we should be leading a debate on that, because if you want to really tackle cars in cities, then you've got to actually get people to appreciate the real cost of using a car in terms of air pollution and space. I mean, I live on a terrace street, just outside the Bourneville Village Trust Estate in Birmingham. It was built in 1900 for horse and cart. We have run out of space for cars. There simply isn't any room left. And some people, yes, the lady said that there's lots of people who are essential car users. Yes, there are essential car users, but there are lots of people who, if they were encouraged or given alternatives, could walk or use public transport, and they'd find it actually liberating in their life. Because I've lived in Hamburg for a long time. You don't need to live in a car in the centre of Hamburg, because it's simply much quicker and easier to get public transport, just like it is in large parts of London. So we need, that would be real levelling up in my view. Let's have that new London-style transport system everywhere, and we shouldn't be assuming that it's not possible in rural areas.
Yeah, I agree with Liz completely on the WHO targets and why we need to do that. I think there's something, wherever we are with the national debate about transport, there's something just still fundamentally broken in the background. That in London, for instance, the fare box is supposed to carry the transport system. That was the deal Boris Johnson did as mayor. And it has a huge impact on fares and how you fund a transport system. And nationally, we've got inflation escalators built into our rail fares. At a time, as Liz is hinting, in Europe, everyone is seeing reducing the cost of public transport fares as a cost of living and environmental response. And I think if we don't break those links and look for new sources of investment, many of the problems we're talking about in terms of rural transport aren't going to be solved, but also city transport. And the social isolation of not having a bus route that serves your nearby town or town centre in our small towns and cities, I think is just not factored into anything that is often talked about. And it's something that's personal to me, because the bus route I grew up on used to run till 10:30 at night, and you could work in town, you could get home, you could go out, you could get home. They now finish at 6, and Worcestershire failed to get its bus deal. And this competition-based approach the government's taken to bus deals is dreadful. It's pitting community against community, and there's no sense of social justice in it. The Treasury attitude to infrastructure as well is all growth-based. So everything that we're talking about, a new station in Perry Bar, an extension to a tram link, you cannot see that through the prism of just growth alone if we're to get a social justice and environmentally based transport network. And whenever we see cost of living mentioned in the terms of transport, it is normally about the cost of filling up a family car. And that is important, and people are really hurting. But the long-term solution to that is breaking that link between the family car and being able to live a successful and active life and get to work and look after your family. And you should be doing that around public transport. So road user charging, but why do we have to beg for these things? And if a city wants to do it, if a town wants to do it, you don't need a metro mayor, or you shouldn't need to. I think things like tourist taxes as well, solution to rural transport, because most of our rural towns and coastal towns don't have those tools in their arsenal at the moment. A Labour government should be giving Great Yarmouth that power if that's what Great Yarmouth wants. How they deploy it is then up to them and their citizens and businesses.
Fantastic. Now listen, we've just got a little bit of time left to see if there's another couple of questions. Oh, I knew you'd do that to me. Right, I'm going to take the 3 people whose hands have just gone up, which is there, and there. And then that will be the last 3 questions. If you could make them brief, because then we'll try and bring in all the panelists to answer all your points. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lucy Sumner. I'm from the Weaver Vale CLP, which is about half an hour's drive from Liverpool, but I'm also a parish councillor and I'm chairing an active travel group. And one of the things that we are looking at the moment is the difficulty in a rural community of the bus services being so infrequent that they're actually usable at all. So as an example, my car was getting fixed, wanted to take my child to Forest School, which is a 12-minute drive, but it would have taken me about 2 hours with a half-hour walk included as well on public transport. It wasn't feasible, so we just couldn't really go. One of the things we were kind of maybe looking at is in a rural community, the micro scooters, e-bikes. Is there a possibility with a town of a population of around 9,500 to pilot a scheme with micro scooters or e-bikes?
Okay, if you can pass the microphone across.
Thank you. Mark Wolfson from Hartsmere, just on the edge of London and Hertfordshire. Picking up on micromobility, and particularly this point about small towns, what's the panel's view on the unregulated private scooter market and what should be done? Potentially, that's a solution to the small towns where the public schemes aren't economic.
Okay, and it was over on this side.
Thanks. My name is Beverly Robbins. I'm also going to ask about e-scooters. I wanted to know, what would you like to see by way of regulation to increase the uptake of e-scooters?
Well, I think I'm going to be cruel and heartless and come straight to Matthew, who I think will probably have thoughts about all three of those questions, and I'd like to thank the audience for them. And I will then ask the other panellists if they've got anything that they would like to add, or if they want to disagree with Matthew, of course.
Thanks. So on the rural services, I think I would probably refer you back to what I said earlier around, I think operators would find it very difficult to run that without some kind of support from the local, regional, parish council, or whatever it might be, unless it was attached to a very large city scheme nearby. So you're quite close to Liverpool. I don't know if you're in the sort of combined authority area. So something perhaps that Liam and I could talk about later on, about how potentially operators can help in that, except it would, unless it had subsidy, it would need to be attached to a profitable city scheme where you could then have cross subsidies within the same contract, if that makes sense. When it comes to private e-scooters, so they are currently illegal. The government, the previous government, I don't have to refer to it, the government before it fell to pieces had just announced that it was intending to create a new class of vehicles. The problem with e-scooters at the moment, I don't want to get too granular on this, is they are classified as a motor vehicle, which is pretty daft. They're 35 kilos as opposed to whatever tons. It's to create a new class of vehicle, somewhere in between an e-bike and a motor vehicle, which seems sensible to us. We hope that the new administration will continue with that. We think that's the case. We're not absolutely 100% sure that the government intends to carry on the work of the previous Transport Secretary and his ministers. But when it comes to the regulation, we, in large part, what is good about the UK, the way the UK has approached the shared schemes, is that they haven't had these sort of free-for-alls that you've seen in some of the Nordics. So some of the Nordics see free-for-alls, mad competition for pricing, price wars, probably a bit of a race to the bottom. Whereas if you structure regulation properly, give, for example, 5-year tenders, contracts, you will see us all competing like mad to give the best tender response you can possibly get. But then the city could hold us to strong SLAs, and we can really provide a service and invest in that area over that 3-year contract. So I think that's a sort of regulatory model, I think, that would really work. And then we can partner with, when it comes to ticket integration and mobility service, all that kind of thing. You can only do that when you've got certainty of several years worth of contract, because it's expensive doing all the integrations, working out your op zones, where the parking goes, all that kind of thing. It takes a while and a lot of effort. And what you need is enough time to get the return on that. On the private e-scooters, we feel as a company that they are part of the solution, and they ought to be legalised, as I said, the government is thinking of doing, except there should be a level playing field with the shared ones. So that comes with type approval by the DFT. At the moment, they don't check them. Our vehicles are type approved and licensed by the DFT. They would need to have that. Some kind of insurance, probably motor insurance, and some other type of third-party insurance in the way that we currently have to have as well. And the final thing we ought to say is, currently for the shared schemes, you need a driving license. That can be provisional, and all the operators have gone for 18. We don't know what the driving license is solving, because it's a big blocker for uptake, and you want to encourage uptake, because surely you want to delay the age people get their first driving license, don't you, to push out when they may buy their first car. So requiring a driving license is quite a blocker for that, and we think there are other proxies for checking people's identification.
Right, I can see that the microphone is just in front of Liz, so I'm going to call on her next and then ask Philip.
I just wanted to say, I think e-scooters have got an important role, and I know that in Birmingham they are, a third of the journeys would otherwise have been taken by people in cars, probably single persons in cars. So I'm coming around to them to a certain extent, but as a local councillor, they are, a lot of people are complaining about them because they're concerned about their safety as pedestrians on pavement. So in the hierarchy that I think of, it's walking, cycling, public transport, freight, and then private car use. So anything that makes it, that puts people off walking is an issue. So we do need some regulation. We need to keep them off pavements. We need technology to keep them off pavements. We need the docking stations on the carriageways. That's a big lobbying point from visually impaired and blind organisations. And we need to think about the speed that they're going at. Because yesterday I was on a critical mass bike ride through South Birmingham along one of our segregated cycle routes, and we met a couple, 2 adults on one of the Voy scooters doing what they shouldn't have been doing, which was riding it together as fast as they could within the speed limit that you've got. And all those sorts of issues. Those are that's the nitty gritty stuff about them. And then the other thing that's on my mind is that in Birmingham, I think in the West Midlands, 75 or 76% of the users are men. So we need to look at, are they attractive to women and other, so there's an inclusion issue there as well. So I think there's a number of issues about their use, but in general, they are part of mode shift, and getting the shift away from cars.
Yeah, huge risk I repeat, so I won't repeat stuff that Liz says. Take it as read that I agree with what a lot has been said. London Councils is working with TfL on the London pilot, and that's a mixed pilot between London boroughs and TfL with a series of providers. But what that gave us, I think, was the ability to really do that geofencing, looking at pedestrianised town centres and speed, allowing local boroughs to shape where docking stations were, move them onto carriageway, and also look at the user insight and to start thinking about a sort of higher structure that might incorporate groups that you wanted to incentivize with lower fares, so a social justice element. I think the challenge has been for the public, they just see them often just scooters, and a lot of the debate and the distress, I think, from residents is the unregulated side. And so getting that through Parliament and getting that very stable regulation, I think, is the most essential thing. They are enabling for disabled adults. I think there is a generation of disabled adults that are coming of age now that don't see motor car as their mode, and they, if you've got reduced lung capacity, if you have some mobility problems, actually scooters can be a real part of that solution. I don't want to pit disabled groups against each other, because I think there's some really valid concerns. I suppose the last thing I would say about them is that hierarchy of making sure that they don't take over active travel, and we end up in a sort of Wally world where we're all just using personal e-mobility, because we'll lose all of the active travel and social benefits that we get from sharing experiences on buses and walking in our town centres.
Right at the beginning, because these things are badly made, they're causing fires, the private ones are causing fires and so on, and then there's the danger not only to other road users, pedestrians, but I believe that a massive increase in injuries and serious injuries, making death. But I suspect the majority of those, looking at some of the ways some of them ride, I think probably the rider themselves was the which makes the injured or killed. But the fear, there's no doubt, when you're particularly if you're on or people with small children, physically frail people, people with sight and hearing impairment, there's no doubt that they feel frightened. Now, whether that fear is justified in terms of the actual collisions between bikes and them is justified or not, I don't know. But the other problem is why do people ride on the pavements? Because they're into segregated paths so much of the time, or junctions are just so badly designed that when Andy Burnham and Chris Borden started work in Manchester on active travel and they focused first on junctions, which was different from how it was routes in ones of the junctions in Manchester, and I thought that was a really good way. So we're not going to deal with this issue of e-scooters and some cyclists on pavements until we actually make a road safer to ride in. And that there has to be some form of regulation, both of the physical bike and riding behaviour. That is a challenge, and I don't know how much of that is a British issue or how much is it to do with prospective quite rightly mentioned gender. We at all points of parliamentary group on cycling and walking had a whole session. One of the it was responsible, and they've done a piece of, always done a piece of research. Oh, sorry, it was with Women in Transport. Sorry, not cycling and walking. Women in Transport organisation, and launching in Parliament of gender, e-scooter trials and gender, and that was really interesting.
Yeah. Last words to Liam?
Last words, and very quickly. First and foremost, Lucy and Liam, I don't know exactly where you live, but if you're in the Runcorn constituency, you're in the Liverpool City region and Hackney, as a conversation with you about going with fishery regulation and how we would like to extend things like the e-scooter scheme right across the region, not just within Liverpool City Council. If you're in the Frodsham, Hellsby, Northwood bits, those are actually in Cheshire West, but we work very closely with them on cross-boundary issues, so we might feel the opportunity there.
Speak at the end.
I think the kind of key element on e-scooters, though, look, our trial here in the Liverpool City part of the region has been really successful, but we think this is a classic example where it should involve Metro West, Glanville authorities, and top-tier authorities, because naturally we want to roll out the e-scooter scheme much wider across the region. But we want to integrate it in buses and trains. What we don't want is what's happened in other parts of the world where we've got lots of different providers and you can literally look at the streets and do it in a completely unintegrated way. Then when you look at the kind of private e-scooter market, it's absolutely ravaging down the bottom, and we're not going to be in a position where we can turn around to people in the future and say, you can't buy your own private e-scooter. But we do need to regulate them really, really heavily. When you think about the fact that some of them don't have speed restrictions, it's really dangerous. And it needs to be within a national framework of standards. So if someone wants to buy one, absolutely it's safe in the way that absolutely the shared schemes have been.
Well, I hope you agree that from exploding scooters to road pricing to rural to urban to buses to active travel, this panel has covered it all. Thank you very much to Lloyd for participating and working with SERA on setting this up. Thank you very much to all of you, but definitely thank you to the panel. Can you show your appreciation? I think our next event in this room is not immediately afterwards, so if you want to get yourself a coffee or something else from